In 2015, after decades of speculation, billions of barrels of oil and trillions of cubic feet of natural gas were found off the coast of Guyana. This discovery catapulted the country into political chaos and onto the world stage.
We have oil, we have gas, but thank God that this disclosure is made on the eve of the elections so that your new government with clean hands can take control of the oil sector.
But what does this oil mean for Guyana? And what does the World Bank have to do with it?
Die Weltbank wurde gegründet nach dem Ende des Zweiten Weltkriegs.
At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 allied and associate countries arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference.
Und sie hatte damals die Aufgabe, Europa wieder aufzubauen.
They will work in the seclusion of this White Mountains resort.
Und genau darum geht es eigentlich, um den Aufbau in armen Ländern, in Entwicklungsländern.
These meetings are designed to promote trade in the post-war world and to create a foundation for lasting peace.
Der Traum der Weltbank ist, die Armut zu bekämpfen. Tut sie das? Das ist eine ganz andere Geschichte.
In my mind, there's actually no other organization that has quite the reach of the World Bank. Their portfolio is across the world. The World Bank is involved in changing policies that are really important to the investment flows in the world.
Die Weltbank arbeitet auf verschiedenen Ebenen. Und eine der Ebenen ist die, dass sie, wenn sie Armut bekämpfen, wenn sie Projekte macht, dass sie da eigentlich ganz gut aufgestellt ist und tatsächlich sinnvolle Projekte macht, Solarzellen aufstellt oder im Gesundheitswesen aktiv ist. Wo sie aber zunehmend Probleme hat, ist im fossilen Bereich, weil sie dort nämlich verheimlicht, was sie wirklich tut.
The World Bank made a pledge back in December 2017.
Today, we're announcing that the World Bank Group will no longer finance upstream oil and gas after 2019. Thank you.
So many of my colleagues who work in a field where they hold public institutions accountable, when they hear these grand pledges that the World Bank is making, they want to celebrate. We want to feel like, oh, good, we've made a difference, we've made a positive change. And so I'm kind of a downer in my field because I'm never celebrating, because I've kind of learned through watching the World Bank over 20 years that they leave the loopholes so wide that you could drive a truck through.
Now, just as in our coal policy, we haven't done any coal since 2010, we still leave the possibility that in exceptional circumstances, the poorest countries may need some help, but the policy will change and change dramatically.
But has the change really been that dramatic? If you are interested in the answer to this question, one place you could look is to the northern shores of South America. When ExxonMobil discovered oil off the coast of Guyana in 2015, it was a much-needed jackpot for the company. With little history of its own in oil and gas, the government quickly sought advice and loans from the World Bank. The millions they have received have been spent hiring consultants meant to advise them on all aspects of the project. But has the World Bank done well by Guyana? And are they sticking to the spirit of their pledge to all of us? In early 2020, Uta Kochi from the human rights and environmental NGO Urgewald decided to travel to Guyana to find out more.
klar, wir werden nur einen winzigen Teil des Landes kennenlernen können. Wir werden in diesem Gebiet uns aufhalten. Iwo Krama, hier werden wir in diesem Gebiet sein. Guyana ist ein Land im Norden Südamerikas, ein Land, das ungefähr 780.000 Einwohnerinnen hat. Und wir machen eine Fact-Finding-Mission. Das heißt, wir informieren uns beim Herumreisen, wir sprechen mit Leuten, wir lernen das Hinterland kennen und wir erleben es auch, wie heute schon der Klimawandel das Leben in Guyana beeinträchtigt.
In Georgetown, Uta meets with international environmental lawyer Melinda Janke.
The announcement was made in 2015, just before the 2015 elections. And then in 2016, the then minister responsible for petroleum signed a new petroleum agreement, which was a closely guarded secret. And the government refused to release this contract. So right away, that's a very bad sign. Your oil sector is starting off with secrecy, with ministers believing that they can do what they like without public scrutiny. When they did release it, I think that a lot of people were quite shocked by how atrocious and one-sided the deal was.
I think we've got a very, very poor deal. 2% royalty is perhaps the lowest in the world. I've done the research and it varies from about 10 to 25%. And we've got 2% royalty. And then all the taxes have been waived. Exxon is not going to pay any taxes.
The World Bank doesn't have a great track record in turning oil, gas, or any extractive industry for that matter into benefits for the poor in countries. Often they end up making a country less stable and less democratic if you read some of the research that's done on the industry in general.
The government officials ignore the advice of experts. Wait a little, let us study the figures and so on. They just went ahead and signed. 2 days after, Exxon announced this big fine.
Als die Weltbank im letzten Jahr 2019 das letzte Projekt bewilligt hat, nämlich eine Beratung der Regierung in Höhe von 20 Millionen Euro, war diese Regierung in Guyana eigentlich durch ein Misstrauensvotum abgewählt.
The World Bank acted illegitimately and possibly illegally in moving ahead with projects with a finance ministry for which there was no official Minister of Finance because of the no confidence motion.
Wenn man Kritik übt an der Weltbank in dieser Frage, dann ist die Reaktion im Grunde genommen schamlos, weil man sagt einfach, wir beraten doch die Regierung. Wir unterstützen die Regierung, sich darauf vorzubereiten. Aber die Weltbank sagt nicht, dass es Guyana eine Wahl hätte.
To learn more about what some of these alternatives could be, Uta and her team traveled to the interior of the country. They have not just arrived in rural Guyana, but in the middle of one of the most diverse ecological regions on the planet, called the Guyana Shield.
So, let's go to the Iwo Krama Lodge.
Dr. Patrick Chesney, a lecturer at the University of Guyana, explains.
We can use the word pristine to describe the intact nature of the ecosystems. You can fly in light aircraft for hours and you see unbroken canopy. So they are very, very unique ecosystems and a large number of endemic species, species that are not found anywhere else on Earth.
You know, there's a famous quote, one's mind, once stretched by a new idea, never regains its original proportions. A trip in Guyana is a trip of a lifetime. It's really an experience that you cannot really find in many other places in the world. I'm Luke Johnson. I'm a small tour operator. I'm also a tour guide. Guyana has 83,000 square miles. That's our total landmass. But 80% of the population live on a narrow strip along the coast. And the indigenous people who live here have been the models of sustainable use of the forest for thousands of years. So this forest is basically intact. Because it is so intact, there's a high number of biodiversity species. We're the northern part of the Amazon rainforest. So we have all the large species of the Amazon, from the largest cat, largest reptile, most powerful raptor in the world, largest spiders. So we're the land of the giants. Quite frankly, Guyana has enough other resources. We didn't need to drill into our oil. It could have stayed in the ground. A lot of these corporations tend to think about immediate economic gain, and they don't think about tomorrow, just like a lot of politicians. So they think in the lifespan of their term, which is very short-sighted. As we like to say in Guyana, they don't see past their nose. But we have to, as a people, try to get the powers that be to think ahead.
To realize this goal, experts argue that more focus needs to be placed on the country's natural wealth, and that education and Guyanese-led research can help.
That will allow us to better understand our natural environment, better understand the potential of the natural wealth that exists, and to be able to develop economic models for monetizing of nature.
Okay, it's free, so just
With their trip to the hinterland coming to an end, it's time to return to the capital and learn more about how oil production is threatening this and so much more in the region.
Die Weltbank hat Guyana lange Zeit ignoriert und dann wurde vor der Küste Öl entdeckt. Anscheinend ist die Regierung von Guyana auf die Weltbank zugegangen und hat darum gebeten, Unterstützung zu bekommen. Und die Weltbank leistet inzwischen seit 2015 auch Unterstützung, Beratung für die Regierung Guyanas und ebnet damit den Weg für die Exploration, für die Förderung und Eröffnung der Ölfelder.
I grew up in Guyana, and then I went to school in England. When I qualified as a solicitor in England, I went to work for a law firm in the City of London, and from there I moved to BP, British Petroleum. I came back to Guyana because this is where I'm from, and I very quickly became involved in environmental law, and I lobbied the government to change the law, and that's why we have the Environmental Protection Act. The World Bank has a project to remove some of that environmental protection. They claim that the environmental protection legislation is outdated and complex. I think what the World Bank means is that we have set very high standards for anybody that wants to do oil production, particularly on a planet that is in a climate emergency.
But one area that I think I can bring in what you're talking about and show that they violated it is transparency. Because this is something we can prove, that they did not disclose during the procurement process.
What would be really good is if we could agree that we'll do.
One of the items that the World Bank's technical assistance specifically says is their goal is to draft new laws that pertain to the petroleum sector. And in their procurement plan, the World Bank sets aside $2.2 million to hire a consultancy to draft those laws. We just recently learned that the law firm has been hired, and the law firm that was chosen is Hutton Andrews Kurth. And it turns out that this particular law firm is the go-to law firm for ExxonMobil. How can the World Bank say that their main point is to improve governance when they, in fact, are creating a conflict of interests? And that completely undermines good governance.
Maybe now you're starting to wonder, why would an organization that claims to have the best interest of countries like Guyana at heart do something like this, which so deeply undermines them?
The World Bank's operations in helping Guyana to develop its oil is very typical of what the World Bank does. It actually follows a very typical playbook of the World Bank. As a matter of fact, in just the last 5 years, the World Bank is involved in 45 countries in assisting them, giving them public assistance to increase investments in their oil, gas, and even in about 11 countries, coal.
What has happened in Guyana is what has happened similarly in oil-producing countries, particularly in Africa and elsewhere.
The World Bank funded oil pipeline projects in Chad is raising questions about its operations there, especially as they affect rural villages. Ramon Taylor reports.
When the Chad pipeline project began nearly 10 years ago, the World Bank sought to create a successful poverty reduction model for the country, one that could create $2 billion of revenue for Chad over 25 years.
An increasingly wealthy elite who also control governance and who control access to the benefits of transfers to the country.
The oil is extracted from wells in southern Chad and transported through Cameroon to the Atlantic coast via a 1,000-kilometer pipeline.
In the World Bank's case, when they talk about developing oil or gas in a country, they themselves don't point to any successes that they've had. They say, well, look at Norway and Canada. Those are the examples they use when they tell a country, look, you can have benefits. They do not point to any countries that they've been involved in.
Residents whose land is used for oil extraction were given various forms of compensation, as reported by ExxonMobil, the oil consortium's primary affiliate. The World Bank, which was unavailable to be quoted for this story, says that some of its efforts in providing microloans to villagers and training in small business lending will eventually provide indirect benefits to Chad.
We know that the World Bank pushed the Chad-Cameroon pipeline and almost forced those countries to do the pipeline against the wishes of people in country. And the result of the World Bank intervention has been the impoverishment of people in those countries. It has been the destruction of their cultures and their societies, and it has been the destruction of the environment.
Grace Codindo, Chadian OBGYN and professor at Columbia University, says that new health centers have been built in Chad, but says she hopes that more supplies and equipment will follow.
We really hope that health services well equipped and with enough supplies be made affordable and accessible to all people living in rural areas, because this is where most of people are dying.
Despite these early problems, the World Bank says that Chad's oil pipeline project has complied with the project's original environmental and social safeguards, and that the project's benefits will be evident in time.
Die Weltbank investiert weiter in die falsche Richtung. Deswegen kann man sagen, die Weltbank wird dem Auftrag nicht mehr gerecht, die Armut zu bekämpfen, sondern sie beschleunigt die Faktoren, die zur Armut beitragen.
Exxon is more dependent upon Guyana than Guyana is on Exxon. Because Exxon was a failing, it's been losing money and couldn't get access to, financial support until, this oil discovery.
We've got a raw deal. And Exxon has exploited our eagerness.
The oil majors are all performing terribly from a financial standpoint. For a decade, they have paid out more to their shareholders in the form of dividends and share buybacks than their cash flow from selling oil, gas, and petrochemicals have generated.
So Guyana is solving Exxon's problems. Of course, Exxon is not solving Guyana's problems, and I think the government needs to be aware of that. But, of course, they're not.
The World Bank came in and made that project happen ahead of schedule. ExxonMobil couldn't have been happier. Delays in the project cost the bottom line for ExxonMobil. The World Bank made that go forward. It was 3 months ahead of schedule. That's unheard of. It was reported in the news that it was a record for such an oil field to be developed that fast. That's the World Bank improving governance, making things go fast. And that's the playbook of the World Bank. Streamline investment processes.
As you might be starting to sense, this project is about a lot more than just Guyana and its oil. So what is the vision behind the World Bank's actions? And does it provide a sustainable path forward for Guyana and all of us?
And privilege for me to introduce the President of the United States.
The World Bank is a very big organization with a lot of political interests and a lot of business interests who benefit from oil and gas development.
Governors of the World Bank and its affiliates and of the International Monetary Fund, distinguished colleagues and guests. On behalf of my fellow Americans, I'm delighted to welcome you to the United States and to our nation's capital.
Of course, the most direct linkage is, the U.S. government, of course, would like to see ExxonMobil be successful in developing more oil. And Guyana is a very cheap oil field for them, so they're going to have a huge profit margin. So, of course, the U.S. government's going to support that on the board of the bank.
And Exxon is very, very powerful. It's a very, very powerful institution. And it has a lot of influence over U.S. foreign policy, which has a lot of influence over World Bank policy.
The societies that achieved the most spectacular, broad-based economic progress in the shortest period of time have not been the biggest in size, nor the richest in resources. What has united them all was their belief in the magic of the marketplace.
And consequently, the country is caught in this vice.
Because our investment in the World Bank's operations is so large, we feel a special responsibility to provide constructive suggestions to make it even more effective.
Everybody has to remember that the World Bank is made up of a board of executive directors who make the decision whether or not a project goes forward. And for a country to come out against a project is a very politically difficult thing for them to do.
Our challenge is far greater: lasting worldwide economic expansion. Together, we must make the 1980s an historic era of transition towards sustained, non-inflationary world growth.
In terms of what Guyana has to offer to this global capitalist system, it is oil. And I think all of the interests of the World Bank converge around the support for oil production and oil exploration in the country.
This period of adjustment has not been easy for us. In fact, it's been very painful. But it is the one way that does work, and it's beginning to pay dividends.
They're concerned with the country's ability to repay and draw down on their foreign debt. And I think that, and that has been, the mantra of their sort of neoliberal interventionism.
Das Land wird komplett umgekrempelt. Und wenn man jetzt schaut zum Nachbarland Venezuela, was da das Öl angerichtet hat, wie der Staat im Grunde genommen zusammengebrochen ist, wie Korruption, Missmanagement, Armut, Flucht im Grunde genommen auch schon stattfinden, dann hat Guyana diese Zukunft vor sich, wahrscheinlich. Und die Weltbank ist mit der Türöffner für diese katastrophale Entwicklung.
We cannot forget that how we help them progress economically must be consistent with this highest objective of all, their personal dignity, their independence, and ultimately their freedom. That's what this job of ours is all about. Thank you very much, and God bless you all.
Lasting, expanding global growth. This idea probably shapes more aspects of your life than you even realize. But this idea also has a history.
Everything in Guyana is rooted in its colonial history, and its colonial history has been rooted in the extraction of the resources from Guyana.
It's based on sugar and bauxite and timber, so these primary goods, as opposed to manufactured goods, which generate significantly more money.
Revenues and surpluses have been transferred, to whatever country was its colonial master, which was Holland, France, and then Britain, and now in this neo-colonial environment to foreign investors, etc., etc.
2020, they will start extracting, and there is a graph showing that it will be exhausted in 2038. But that was when they announced the first find. They're finding more and more oil, so that end of the graph is going to be shifting.
This is not the first time that the country would be involved in the production of the major strategic product in the world. It was one of the major producers of sugar when sugar was one of the major strategic products in the world. It was one of the major producers of bauxite when bauxite was the strategic mineral in the world. And it never benefited from these things.
The World Bank is an expert on putting together very complex financial packages, but that's also what makes them difficult to trace, difficult to show what role they're playing.
Diese Verträge wurden nicht öffentlich gemacht und diese Verträge wurden schon gar nicht mit der Bevölkerung zusammen diskutiert.
The World Bank is not often covered in the media, certainly not in the United States media. But an issue I have when I do talk to journalists is they're always trying to make it a more simple story, and they're trying to make it, be able to explain it in a couple sentences.
Die Weltbank, die eigentlich immer einfordert, dass man transparent mit Verträgen umgeht, dass man hohe Standards hat, hat die Regierung von Guyana im Grunde genommen in die falsche Richtung gelenkt.
They're working on policy and drafting laws, and that in itself, the laws can be complicated. Sometimes they're giving a government fund money, and then that fund is giving guarantees to a fossil fuel project. So it's difficult to trace what's going on. So it's very difficult for the general public and for journalists to be able to cover this work.
It is outrageous that they talk about accountability and transparency when in fact the World Bank itself is the most opaque organization and appears to be accountable to no one. and they are certainly not accountable to the people whose lives and environments they damage and destroy.
Die Firma ExxonMobil hat eine sehr, sehr schlimme Vergangenheit. Sie ist bekannt dafür, dass es durchaus auch Ölunfälle gibt. Das Exxon Valdez-Unglück, was vor der Küste Amerikas stattgefunden hat, ist weitaus schlimmer gewesen, als man sich bislang vorgestellt hat. Die Folgen der Ölkatastrophe sind bis heute nicht beseitigt.
Maybe you remember these images from Exxon's past, but its future could look like a much more recent disaster. The almost 5-month-long ordeal that was Deepwater Horizon.
The oil is 2 miles below the seabed, and the ocean is 1 mile deep. This is extremely dangerous, ultra-deep drilling. And the technology to deal with a well blowout is simply inadequate. The environmental permit that was granted to ESSO for the first Liza Phase 1 does not even require ESSO to use a blowout preventer. Now, of course, they will. But the permit only says should. I give you that example to show how clueless the Environmental Protection Agency was when they did that permit.
The environment in the Gulf of Mexico or in Alaska when there was the Exxon Valdez incident, the geography, the marine environment is very different to our environment. The biodiversity in our part of the world is immensely richer, so we are not prepared, no.
This is the longest mud coastline on the planet. It's very, very special. Oil can destroy that in a very short time. There are species out there that we've only now begun to study. This is an area that is rich in marine biodiversity and extremely rich in potential for investigation, research, the future of creating for Guyana a solid natural resource campus, and the scientists of the future. One well blowout will destroy all of that. One tanker collision will destroy all of that.
You've probably seen footage like this many times in your life. The camera looking out the window of a helicopter, and your mind unable to set it all into scale. But there's another, even larger catastrophe quickly bearing down on this low-lying country.
Guyana has 13 billion barrels of oil and 32 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. By any definition, that is a carbon bomb that will destroy global efforts to halt or reduce the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees.
Was die Weltbank in Guyana macht, ist, dass sie das Land berät, auf Öl zu setzen und nicht auf erneuerbare Energien. Die Weltbank sorgt im Grunde genommen damit, dass eine riesige, gigantische Menge an Öl und Gas in Zukunft in die Luft geschleudert wird.
The other thing that they're justifying their involvement in helping to develop more oil in Guyana is they're claiming that, well, Guyana will make money from this and they can use that money to fund maybe protection of the forests or to fund protection from flooding.
Guyana is a high-risk country when it comes to climate change. And therefore, to promote the operations of ExxonMobil is going to have an adverse effect.
Climate change is real, and Guyana as a vulnerable country has already started to experience the impacts of sea level rise, extreme weather events, such as droughts and floods.
Guyana's coastline is 431 kilometers. Out of that, you only have 100 kilometers protected by hard concrete structures, and each kilometer costs $5 million US to build. And they have to be maintained, so it's a huge burden on our resources as well to keep building more seawalls.
In the long run, if you look at the protection of the planet, and if you're looking at future generation, we are contributing in a very big way now to global warming and climate change, and ultimately the destruction of the planet. The planet is on fire.
Eventually, it's going to collapse, and it is collapsing now. We are seeing that vis-a-vis the environmental crisis that we are facing, the crisis in terms of food security, the crisis in terms of the depletion of water resources, etc., etc. And all of this is linked to this notion of development as economic growth.
It's just really clear that we need to shift the global economy, and now, we don't have any time.
Financial analysis can tell a story, and the story is one of long-term decline. This is an industry that, in a sense, led the world economy for decades, but that really started to change in the last 10 or more years.
If you look on their climate change webpage, the World Bank's climate change webpage, the first message that comes up is a stark warning. And it says that if urgent action isn't taken on climate change, 100 million additional people could fall into poverty due to climate change impacts.
When I see something like the Mauritius oil spill or environmental issues, it does indicate that the world really does need a faster transition than many of the oil companies are planning for.
Wenn die erneuerbaren Energien in den nächsten Jahren weiter billiger werden, dann ist Exxon am Ende.
What we have to do now is stop burning fossil fuels immediately and start taking the stock of greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere.
Forests are critical for climate change mitigation. They represent around 12% of global greenhouse gas emissions. They're also important carbon sinks, so they draw down atmospheric carbon and store that carbon into trees and biomass and soil.
The World Bank is not giving any finance to renewable energy in Guyana, despite the fact that the Guyana government has committed to become 100% renewable. How they explain that, they don't.
Step number one would be to get the World Bank projects stopped and move the World Bank out of Guyana. We don't need the World Bank here in Guyana. The second thing would be to put pressure on the Guyana government.
You can't expect people to be born and not want to live a good life. So if we destroy their ability to have a good life now, then the only option for them would be to continue the destruction so that they can have a good life.
But now you might be asking, how do we break these cycles? Experts increasingly suggest that countries like Guyana be released from their foreign debt, allowing them to pursue their own goals and even build regenerative bioeconomies.
A bioeconomy is based on renewable resources. So not oil or mining, for example, but renewable resources that are also disconnected from this sort of growth-based paradigm. Because I think it's really clear at this point that we can't rely on constant economic growth on a finite planet.
This is an incredibly rich country. Guyana is a carbon sink. Every day we are taking out of the atmosphere the greenhouse gases that are killing this planet. Guyana should be paid for that. We have this rich marine biodiversity. Guyana should be paid to protect that, particularly at a time when the oceans are dying and are under threat from greenhouse gases.
It's time for Uta and her team to return home. They do so with a little more knowledge about a very complex situation. And a little bit of hope that both Guyana and the world can find an alternative path.
None of us will be here forever. We'll be gone. Question is, what are we leaving? What is the inheritance that we're leaving for the next generation?
Oil is too expensive for Guyana. We are already paying the price in terms of the undermining of the rule of law and in terms of the damage done to our democracy. That's too high a price to pay.
Guyana has gone through political instability for too long, particularly in terms of our electoral process. So I think political stability is an immediate need for the country to move forward.
People come up to me and they say they support what I do. I also have people who come to me and say they would like to take more of a role, but they are afraid.
Guyana has massive alternatives, and Guyana is very, very well positioned to benefit from much more sustainable policies and practices using its own resources.
My dream for Guyana is to develop along a low carbon green trajectory, utilizing nature to drive economic development and to achieve the aspirations of its people.
A lot of times people living in these small developing countries tend to think in terms of their country. You know, you grow up here, you see all this greenery, it's like we can never finish this. But if we take a little bigger view, we realize that in many countries, like for example Germany, while they have forests, they don't have their original forests. And original forest is very important because biodiversity species that have come to depend on this forest will disappear.
Guyana is 85% forested. In there is a wealth of biodiversity. We have everything that we need in order to be prosperous and peaceful.
Last year in 2019, Guyana was rated the #1 ecotourism destination in the world. So that alone speaks for itself. And as long as we keep developing it in an environmentally sensitive manner, we can continue sustaining it for a very long time.
Always ask questions. Just because someone has a reputation or has a mission, make them be accountable to you. Don't let them be dismissive. And this goes for the journalists. Question the World Bank. If they tell you, oh no, that's not what we're doing, then make them show you exactly what they are doing.
I would say to the World Bank, Guyana is a sovereign nation. Allow Guyana to meet its aspirations, not only as a democratic nation, but a nation of people who desire to be free, who desire to continue to respect nature.
People outside should put pressure on their executive directors to hold the World Bank to account and to put a stop to World Bank intervention in Guyana.
Sie können Briefe schreiben, Sie können Ihre Politiker darauf ansprechen und Sie können natürlich die Nichtregierungsorganisationen unterstützen. Sie können über die Medien sich informieren und Ihre Nachbarn darüber aufklären, was das bedeutet. Und die Menschen können natürlich dazu beitragen, dass sie sagen, wir wollen nicht länger auf Kohle, Öl und Gas setzen, sondern erneuerbare Energien müssen die Zukunft sein und wir sind bereit dazu, dass wir da Geld reinstecken.
If you look at where we are positioned, one of the last standing intact tropical rainforests, the lungs of the world, a carbon sink, a huge carbon sink, a great nursery for the ocean, fish species, etc. These are all factors that have to be taken into consideration so that we do not damage the little that we have left.
We don't need oil. Guyana has enough wind, water, and solar energy, enough sunshine, so we have absolutely no need to go anywhere for anything. We have everything.